Hi all. Today we'll be discussing St. Coleridge's Biographia Literaria, chapter 14, which is the part of criticism. Biographia Literaria is considered as a written monument of Coleridge's critical work, which is really written in 24 chapters during the period of 1815 to 17. In this critical disquisition, Coleridge concerns himself not only with the practice of criticism but also with its theory. In his practical approach to criticism, we get the glimpse of Coleridge the poet, whereas in theoretical discussion, Coleridge the philosopher came to the center stage. In chapter 14 of Biographia Literaria, Coleridge's view on nature and function of poetry is discussed in philosophical terms. The poet within Coleridge discusses the difference between poetry and prose and the immediate function of poetry, whereas the philosopher discusses the difference between poetry and poem. He was the first English poet or English writer to insist that every work of art is by its very nature an organic whole. At the first step, he rules out the assumption from Horace onwards had wrought such havoc in criticism that the object of poetry is to instruct, or as a less extreme form of the hearsay had asserted to make men morally better. Coleridge begins this chapter with his views on two cardinal points of poetry. The cardinal points are the power of exciting the sympathy of the reader by a faithful adherence to the truth of nature, and the second one, the power of giving the interest of novelty by modifying with the colors of imagination. According to him, it was decided that Wordsworth would write poetry dealing with the theme of first cardinal point, and the other was to dealt by him. For the first type of poetry, the treatment and subject matter should be, to quote Coleridge, the sudden charm with which accidents of light and shade, which moonlight or sunset diffused over a known and familiar landscape, appear to represent the practicability of combining both. These are the poetry of nature. In such poems, subjects were to be chosen from ordinary life. The characters and incidents were to be such as will be found in every village and its vicinity, where there is a meditative and feeling mind to seek after them or to notice them when they present themselves. In the second type of poetry, the incidents and agents were to be supernatural. In this sort of poetry, to quote Coleridge, the excellence aimed at was to consist in interesting of the affections by the dramatic truth of such emotions as would naturally accompany such a situation, supposing them real. And real in the sense they have been to every human being who, from whatever source of delusion, has at any time believed himself under supernatural agency. With the help of imagination, the natural will be dealt supernaturally by the poet, and the reader will comprehend it with willing suspension of disbelief. The lyrical ballads consist of poems dealing with these two cardinal points, whereas the endeavour of Coleridge was to deal with persons and characters supernatural, and that of Wordsworth was to give charm to nobility to things of everyday by awakening the mind's attention from the lethargy of custom and directing it to the loveliness and the wonders of the world before us. Coleridge did not agree with Wordsworth's views on poetic diction, vindicated his poetic creed in chapter 4 of Biographia Literaria. Coleridge rise in defense to the violent assailant to the language of real life adopted by Wordsworth in lyrical ballads. There had been strong criticism against Wordsworth's views expressed in preface also. Coleridge writes in his defense, had Mr. Wordsworth's poems been the silly, the childish things which they were for a long time described as being, had they been really distinguished from the compositions of other poets merely by meanness of language and inanimity of thought? Had they indeed contained nothing more than what is found in the parodies and pretended imitations of them? They must have sunk at once a dead weight into the slough of oblivion and have dragged the preface along with them. He wrote that the eddy of criticism which whirled around these poems and preface would have dragged them in oblivion. Instead, to quote Coleridge, year after year increased the number of Mr. Wordsworth's admirers. They were found too not in lower classes of the reading public, but chiefly among the young men of strong ability and meditative minds, and their admiration, which is inflamed perhaps in some degree by opposition, was distinguished by its intensity. I might almost say by its religious fervour. Thus, Coleridge gives full credit to the genius of Wordsworth. Coleridge writes, with many parts of this preface in the sense attributed to them, and which the words undoubtedly seem to authorize, I never concurred, but on the contrary, objected them as erroneous in principle and as contradictory both to the other parts of the same preface and to the author's own practice in greater number of the poems themselves. Mr. Wordsworth, in his recent collections, has degraded his prefatory disquisition to the end of his second volume to be read or not at the reader's choice. Hence, Coleridge is frank enough to point out that some of the views of Wordsworth were wrong in principle and contradictory not only in parts of the preface but also to the practice of the poet himself in many of his poems. The poem contains the same elements as a prose composition, but the difference between the composition of those elements and objects aimed at in both the composition, according to the difference of the object, will be difference of the combination. If the object of the poet may simply be to felicitate the memory of the recollect certain facts, he would make use of certain artificial arrangement of words with the help of meter. As a result, composition will be a poem merely because it is distinguished from composition in prose by meter or by rhyme. He further elucidates his viewpoint by various prose writings and its immediate purpose and ultimate end. In scientific and historical composition, the immediate purpose is to convey the truth or facts. In the prose works of the other kinds, like romances and novels, to give pleasure in the immediate purpose, and the ultimate end may be to give truth. Thus, the communication of pleasure may be immediate object of a work, not metrically composed. Coleridge replies that if the meter is superadded, the other parts of the composition also must harmonize with it. In order to deserve the name poem, each part of the composition, including meter, rhyme, diction, and theme, must harmonize with the wholeness of the composition. Meter should not be added to provide merely a superficial, decorative charm. If meter is superadded, all the other parts must be made constant with it. They all must harmonize with each other. A poem, therefore, may be defined as that the a species of composition which is opposed to works of science by proposing for its immediate object pleasure, not truth, and from all other species having this object in common with it. It is discriminated by proposing to itself such a delight from the whole as a compatible with a distinct gratification from each component part. Coleridge asserts the importance of the impression created by harmonious whole of the poem. To him, not one or the other part, but the entire effect, the journey of reading poem should be pleasurable. Thus, Coleridge puts an end to the age-old controversy whether the end of the poem is instruction or delight. Its aim is to definitely to give pleasure, and further, poem has its own distinctive pleasure. That is the pleasure rising from the parts, and this pleasure of the parts supports and increases the pleasure of the whole. Coleridge points out that poetry of the highest kind may exist without meter and even without the contradicting objects of a poem. He gives example of the writings of Plato, Jeremy Taylor and Bible. The quality of the prose in these writings is equal to that of high poetry. John Sharpcross in Biographia Literaria with the aesthetical essays writes, this distinction between poetry and prose is not clear, and instead of defining poetry, he proceeds to describe a poet, and from the poet he proceeds to enumerate the characteristics of imagination. Poetry for Coleridge is an activity of the poet's mind, and a poem is merely one of the forms of its expression, a verbal expression of that activity. And the poetic activity is basically an activity of the imagination. As David Deutsch, who was a critical of history of English literature, points out, poetry for Coleridge is a wider category than a poem. That is, poetry is a kind of activity which can be engaged in by painters or philosophers or scientists, and is not confined to those who employ metrical language or even to those who employ language of any kind. So, poetry in this larger sense brings the whole soul of a man into activity, with each faculty playing its proper part according to its relative worth and dignity. This takes place whenever the synthesizing, the integrating powers of the secondary imagination are at work, bringing all aspects of a subject into a complex unity. Then poetry in this larger sense results. Coleridge is the first English critic who based his literary criticism on philosophical principles. While critics before him had been content to turn a poem inside out and to discourse on its merits and demerits, Coleridge busied himself with the basic question of how it came to be there at all. He was more interested in the creative process that made it what it was than the finished project. Finished product. Okay, that's all. Thank you.